This story began one snowy day. It was incredibly cold outside. The entire estate was covered in snow. One handsome, tall, dark-haired man arrived. The carriage stopped right at this estate, and the butler came out to meet him. Despite the incredible cold, the man was dressed rather lightly. This man was Duke Baldarian. The butler immediately bowed to greet the Duke and said that they had been waiting for him for quite a long time and were therefore very happy that he had returned. The man did not answer this. He only calmly asked where the crown prince was at that moment. Then the assistant answered that, on that day, he was waiting for him in the bedroom and not in the office. As soon as Baldarian heard this, he was a little surprised, because he assumed that it concerned some personal matter. He was interested in what that man had gotten himself into this time. He eventually told the butler that he understood everything and asked to be escorted to the crown prince's bedroom, after which he headed straight to the estate. As soon as the man was inside, they immediately felt some kind of strong, unpleasant smell. The knight who accompanied him noticed it first. The man also noticed this smell. He said that this place was very unpleasant whenever he came here. After that, he turned to the butler and asked if they had gloves so that he would at least not get his hands dirty. The worker immediately took out leather gloves and handed them to the gentleman. He said that he always carried a spare pair with him so that it could help if something happened. The Duke meanwhile put on his gloves, and after he approached the door, he told his assistant to remain outside and wait until he came out. After this, Baldarian opened the door to the bedroom and immediately felt that unpleasant smell even more, and because of this, he even felt a little dizzy. But the man did not stop. He went inside and was immediately met by a maid. She tried not to look at the bed on which the crown prince was located, and next to him there were several other ladies. As soon as the Duke entered, the maid turned to the crown prince and said that a visitor had come to him, and she also named who exactly it was. Baldarian thought at that moment that he was already very tired of being called out every time for all sorts of trifles or forcing people to follow him just to show him all this unpleasant nonsense. The man really didn't understand why he needed this. Then he moved forward and suddenly stepped on a small blanket that was lying on the ground. Of course, he immediately paid attention to this. The man looked down and saw a young girl completely naked. She was lying on the floor next to her. Wine was spilled. She did not react to anything. Seeing her, Baldarian was very surprised. He thought that she was too drunk, or perhaps Dylan had somehow knocked her out because of this. It became even more unpleasant for the man to be in that place. Meanwhile, the crown prince followed his guest and said that it was his fault. He didn't think that Baldarian had already arrived. After all, if he had known, he would have prepared in advance. At that time, other girls kissed him. This man was the crown prince. His name was Dylan. As soon as the Duke came closer to him, he asked why he looked at this whole situation like that. The man suddenly made a very cold-blooded voice and said that this was not the first corpse he had seen in his life. And as soon as the boatman heard that this girl was not alive, he became even more worried. Of course, he didn't expect to hear the fact that she was dead, because he thought that she was simply unconscious or very drunk. And because of this, she couldn't even react to anything. At that moment, Dylan stood up from his seat and said that she said that his name appeared, so he brought her to this place. As soon as the man heard about this, he immediately thought about the fact that he had heard about this several times before. However, he did not think that it could happen so quickly. In fact, one day, out of nowhere, the name of a life and love partner appears on someone's body, and when Baldarian looked down, he actually saw that the girl had the name Dylan. In fact, at first glance, it may seem very romantic that the name of your beloved partner appears on your body. However, the names did not depend on gender, and sometimes the names of an unwanted person appeared. And if the bearer of the name did not physically touch the owner of their name, then quite often such people simply died. Sometimes this was even called a curse. Baldarian thought about what he had heard, that it was quite a rare phenomenon and had practically disappeared from life. However, to see it live, and in this place, he certainly did not expect it. Dylan, meanwhile, smiled and asked his friend what he was thinking about so much that he didn't even react to him for some time. When the guy returned, he said that the girl said that his name appeared on her body and that she would die if she did not touch him. It was for this reason that the man locked her in this place for several weeks in order to check whether it was true or not, because he was really interested. And eventually, she really began to suffer and died. We suddenly laughed and said that he thought it was just a superstition. However, in the end, he was convinced that all these fairy tales turned out to be reality. The man continued to laugh and told his friend that this was incredibly interesting, and now he was making them understand a lot. Baldarion looked at him with a disapproving gaze. He thought that the crown prince had already gone completely mad. However, in a cautious voice, he asked if the man had really called him to take care of the body. However, the guy suddenly stopped him and said that of course it wasn't so. He asked if the man really thought that Dylan would call him because of such a minor problem. He put his hand on his shoulder and said that in any case he had to go with him. Dylan smiled and said that he had left him a special gift in the next room, so he had to take a look. Some time passed since then, and Dylan brought him to a rather dark room, where all around the perimeter there was that unpleasant smell again, because of which the man's head became a little clouded. The crown prince walked forward and asked if it was true that compared to his room, this place was quite cold. Then he explained to his friend what he wanted to show him earlier. However, the suffering did not subside, so he decided to keep the room cool so that the situation would not get worse. Baldarion was already a little wary. He turned to the crown prince and asked what he wanted to show him. Then Dylan smiled and asked if the man remembered the Marquis of Pravita, the man he had executed several years ago. The guy, hearing this name, immediately thought about whether he was really talking about that traitor who simply had to be killed. The crown prince smiled and said that this was the person he was talking about, after which he looked at his friend and said that his daughter had been with him all this time. Then he pointed towards the window and told him to let him introduce his little toy Lilith. He opened the closet in which the girl was lying. She was completely exhausted. Many bruises and scratches could be seen on her body. She had beautiful blonde hair. Lilith was in a thin dress. As soon as she heard the door to the closet open, she opened her eyes a little. However, she felt so bad that she didn't even change her facial expression. And as soon as Balderin saw this girl, he immediately became very scared. He stood still and could not take his beautiful golden eyes off her. But at that very moment, Dylan suddenly grabbed her hand roughly and said that of course he wanted to show the man not only her. He quickly pulled her out of the closet and sat her on his knees in front of him, saying that her pulse had become weaker in the last few days and that she had begun to lose weight quite actively. After that, Dylan took off her robe a little and said that as soon as he examined her body, he saw that the name Baldarion appeared on her shoulder. And it was really so. It was for this reason that the crown prince said that he could give this girl to a man. As soon as the duke saw this name, he was even more shocked by this development. He definitely did not expect this. Dylan, meanwhile, said that about 3 days after this name appeared, she developed a high fever and could not even move her limbs normally. He moved closer to Lily, lightly bit her ear, leaving Arena there, and said that this was probably a symptom of the appearance of a name. After the man moved away from this poor girl, he said that the man would carry her in his arms, throw her into the carriage, and do whatever he wanted. Now this girl belonged to him, so he could have fun with her as he wanted. Then we grabbed her very roughly by the hand. After that, he pushed the girl so that she fell into the arms of Baldarion. As soon as the man managed to grab her, the crown prince immediately began to applaud and laugh loudly. He said that the man had a good reaction. Meanwhile, the girl was getting worse and worse. She really did have a high temperature. Every breath she took was very difficult for her. The crown prince turned and started to walk away, waving his hand. He said that there was a chance that maybe it was a common name, so Baldarion should be careful in dealing with her. He also decided to add just in case. If the man suddenly worried that he didn't touch her with a finger, then Baldarion didn't have to worry. She was all his. After that, the man turned around and closed the door behind him, leaving the duke alone with poor Lilith, who couldn't even stand on her feet. The man looked at the girl for a while. He thought that his name really suddenly appeared on the body of a person with whom he had never even met. It was all very strange for him. Several hours passed from that moment, and the man returned to his estate with the girl. The Baldrin's assistant, as soon as he learned all the details of the situation, was incredibly shocked. His name was Moses, and he wondered if it was really true that the name His Highness appeared in the deed of this girl Baldurin. Meanwhile, he laid her on the bed and, covering her with a blanket, said that it was so. Moses brought some hot water and asked him if he would like to see it for himself. However, the man, sitting down on a small sofa that was next to the bed, said that he had told him that this was all true. He had seen it with his own eyes. For this reason, he asked his assistant to study as much information as possible about the phenomenon of the name and provided it to him. Moses bowed and immediately said that he understood everything, and after that, he went to carry out the man's order. As soon as the man was left alone, he immediately began to think about this whole situation again. Baldarion thought about the fact that a little earlier, this girl suffered from a fever. However, even on the way to the estate, the color of her face noticeably improved, and she slept peacefully now. He remembered the words he had once heard about the phenomenon of the name. They said that if a person who had a name on his body did not regularly touch the owner, he would die. And now it became clear to him what that meant. The man thought about what this now meant, that the girl would die if she didn't touch him. He decided to come closer to her, sat on the edge of the bed, and adjusted her hair, which fell right on her face. Meanwhile, the girl had already woken up and looked at the unfamiliar man. With her beautiful ruby eyes and a quiet voice, Lilith asked who he was. The man did not expect that she would suddenly wake up so quickly, and because of this, he was a little surprised. The guy immediately got out of bed. He already wanted to answer something, but to his surprise, Lilith simply fell asleep again. At that moment, his face turned a little red. He immediately became interested in what she was dreaming about at that moment, because the girl continued to say something in her sleep. However, her eyes never opened. Several hours passed from that moment, and Lily finally woke up completely. She sat up in bed, and her breathing was difficult. The girl felt panic. She thought that when she woke up, she had a momentary vision of a person, and she even thought that it was just a dream that she did not remember well. Then she suddenly felt a strong headache. Lilia realized that she felt very bad, and she did not know why and how to fix it. Then she looked around and noticed that she was in a completely unfamiliar place. Lily realized that she first had to figure out where she was. In fact, it didn't look like Dylan's room at all. Then she saw the flag hanging on the wall opposite and immediately recognized it, and all because it belonged to the Duchy of Eustacia. And this meant that she ended up in this very place. The girl got out of bed and did not understand what she was doing in this place at all. She also really hoped that her assumption that Dylan handed her over to this duke was wrong. However, she thought that this could be quite possible because Dylan knew very well that this duke was her enemy and could do this on purpose. The girl could not hold back her tears. She cried, holding this terrible flag in her hands, and thought that he simply would not stop to mock the girl, and in this place she would be even worse off than the crown prince. In fact, she knew perfectly well about the events that happened a year ago. It was the day when absolutely everything in her life was taken away from her. Lyle was still quite small then. She didn't know everything. Her father ran and hid her in the closet. He said that she had to hide there and under no circumstances come out. The man turned to her and told her to listen to him carefully, as he explained that the reign of the current emperor was a den of beasts who abused their power, and that is why he believed that he made the right decision. However, he really regrets that he dragged his daughter into all this at that moment. Her father could not even hold back his tears, although he never cried in front of her. Leela, seeing this, realized that everything was very serious. She couldn't even cry because she was in shock. In the end, the estate was instantly captured by the Imperial Knights of Justice. The man who was hiding in the room with his daughter finally saw that she was also captured by these knights, ordered the arrest of all members of the traitorous house of Vaccinates. For this reason, they began to take the girl away. Lily screamed with all her might and asked to be let go. She thought that her father could somehow help, but he was also captured, and so her family and friends were taken to the palace. And after that, the so-called traitorous vaccine house simply took and executed absolutely everyone on the orders of the crown prince. They were all killed. Lily's father was the first to die. She was sitting next to her mother, and right before her eyes, his head was cut off. The girl was so shocked that she couldn't even cry. Her whole body was shaking, and she clung to her mother, as if she were her last hope. The woman meanwhile screamed loudly. She turned to His Highness and asked him to spare her daughter. After all, this child knows nothing, and she did nothing. The woman believed that it would be unfair to take her life. However, after Mom said this phrase, she was also beheaded, and finally it was Lily's turn. She was also to be executed next, and the girl had already accepted her fate. She understood that she definitely could not be saved. However, the crown prince suddenly stopped the knight who had already swung at the girl. He said that killing something so beautiful was a waste of resources. The man came closer to Lila. He raised her gaze so that she would look at him and said that there were soap on earth of such amazing women like her, so he did not want her to be killed. At that moment, the girl understood that perhaps death was an even better option than what was to happen next. However, the crown prince said that she had to be left alive and handed over to him in the palace. Of course, the knights were very surprised by this decision of His Highness. One of them even began to protest. He said that she was the daughter of a traitor, so he did not understand how they could leave her alive. But Dylan then calmly replied that they had to take care of everyone so that there were no loose ends. The knights had nothing more to say. They understood that they had the right to contradict their ruler, so they simply fell silent. We were quite happy with this outcome of events. The man smiled joyfully, stood up, turned to Lilia, and told her to remember this moment. Because he was her savior, he saved her life. Then the man took her face in his hands and asked if she now understood that her whole life now belonged to him. After that, he wiped the blood of her father and mother from his face and licked his finger, smiling, and said that this would all continue until he got bored. And it was from that moment that Lily began to live as Dylan's toy. Of course, it was a terrible time. However, ending up in the estate of her enemy was even worse for her. But the girl quickly put her emotions aside. She understood that this was not the right time to be sentimental. She looked around and thought that she had to run away before she lost consciousness again. Otherwise, everything would be useless. When the girl quietly opened the door and began to run slowly through the estate, Lily thought that if this was really the estate of justice, then in that case it was no different from the palace, and this meant that she had ended up in real hell. Soon the girl ran out into the street. There was snow everywhere. It was very cold, but she did not pay attention to it. Life was more important to her. Lily ran headlong, and soon she finally found herself in the forest. The girl did not stop there. She ran towards freedom. Since then, several hours have passed. Baldarian decided to go hunting early in the morning, as he always did. He noticed that there would be a strong wind that evening, and when he chased the wolf he wanted to kill, he suddenly saw that it had stopped. The man was a little alarmed by this. However, he looked more closely and saw that there was someone else there. Baldarian thought that this was very strange. But when he rode closer, he saw a girl who was lying right on the cold ground. He did not understand what she was doing in this place, and immediately got off his horse. Meanwhile, the man called his assistant, Tyreen. He immediately ran to his lord, and bowing, asked if he had called him. The man, continuing to look at the girl, said that he should take her back to the outbuilding from which she apparently escaped. The man began to lift the girl, but turned to his master and asked if she would be okay, because it seemed to him that her condition was very weak. Baldarem examined the girl for some time. He noticed that she had been wandering around the forest all this time. This meant that she had not even run barefoot, since her feet were badly injured. The man thought that if she understood that this was the estate of justice, then it was quite natural that she would behave in such a way. So he was not surprised. Then the man handed the gun to his assistant and said that he would take her himself. He picked her up in his arms and thought that if he were her, he would also hate justice and would want to run away from this place as far as possible. However, he looked at her sleeping face and thought that it was an imperial order, so for that reason he had no choice. He walked back to his horse and said that they needed to return to the estate because it was too cold outside. His assistant immediately said that he understood everything, and they decided to return. Several more hours passed from that moment. Lilia opened her eyes and again saw the same ceiling as last time. She did not understand why this happened because she thought that she had escaped through the forest. However, somehow she found herself in this place again. After this, the girl sat up on the bed and suddenly saw that she was already in completely different clothes. She tried to pull her legs to the floor, but she did not succeed because she saw that her ankles were tied to the bed. Lyle was very surprised. However, at that moment, she heard a man's voice that said that he put it on her. This man turned out to be Baldarian. He stood near one of the columns and said that if she runs away and in this huge storm, and what happens to her, then he will have big troubles, and she will become a real headache for him. The man definitely didn't want to deal with this for this reason. He simply had to take such measures. Lilia looked at him in the meantime and immediately asked in a trembling voice whether he was the owner of the house. She still managed to lower her feet to the ground. She screamed loudly and told him to take off these chains immediately. She demanded that he do it. At that moment, she started having a severe headache again. However, she said that she didn't know what he was trying to do, but she definitely didn't want to be in that place. Leela eventually managed to even get back on her feet. However, she began to lose consciousness again due to the intense pain. The girl almost fell. However, Baldarion managed to run up to her in time and grabbed her by the waist. The man did not let her fall. Then he turned to her and asked where she was planning to go in this state when she could not even stand on her feet. At the same time, he began to unbutton her dress from behind. Lilia panicked. She asked what he was doing and also asked him to let her go immediately. But the man did not stop. He unbuttoned her dress so that the tattoo was clearly visible. He said that he was helping her, so she should not move. After that, he put his hand on his name, which was imprinted on her body. At that moment, the girl really felt an incredibly great relief. She did not understand what it was connected with, but it really helped her. Of course, Lyle didn't want the man to touch her at all, so she managed to turn away from him and pushed him aside, telling him to let her go. But the Baldarum did not listen to her. He grabbed the girl by the hand and moved her closer to him. The man hugged her around the waist and said that he told her that it would help, so he wanted her to listen to him. When the man whispered in her ear that she might have been confused, however, the name that appeared on her shoulder belonged to him. He also said that this all means that when he touches her, her condition improves. Lilia was very shocked when she heard about this. She could not believe that this could really be true. Well, the man said that this is all so, according to the report of his assistant, he found out that there was such a phenomenon that was called by a common name. Lily, hearing about this, immediately asked what it meant, because she had never heard of such a thing and did not understand what he meant. But the Duke explained that this was when, within a year of the appearance of one person's name, it also appeared in another person's. He explained that this general occurrence of the name was more common than isolated cases. Therefore, Baldarum also told the girl whether she liked it or not. However, she would spend the next year with him. She simply had no choice, because otherwise she would die. The man also said that this was all because if he found out that her name appeared on his body after she died, his life would also end. For this reason, they could not be separated even if they really wanted to. Lily, of course, didn't like all this. However, the man, putting his arms around her waist, said that in return, he guaranteed her safety throughout this year, so she didn't have to worry. At that moment, the man continued to hold her with his hands and with his fingers touched the place where his name was written, which made the girl feel very awkward. However, gradually, her condition really began to improve. Soon she turned to the man and asked him to move a little further away from her because it was too close, and because of this, it was very awkward. At that moment, the Duke thought about the fact that even if she was saying no with her mouth, her body was definitely reacting positively to his touch, and he noticed it. He also thought about the fact that the symptoms of the name must be so irresistible that even the touch of someone despised could not be refused, and it was for this reason that the girl, even hating him with all her soul, continued to stand next to him. For her, the pain was unbearable, and in the end, she had to simply endure this contact between the manifester of the name and the owner of the name. It actually caused unusual sensations that even the man himself felt. He sighed heavily and said that she only had to endure 1 year of being in this place. If the name did not appear on it by that time, then he would of course let her go and she would be able to live her own life, forgetting about what happened. In order for the girl not to try to run away again, he said that she would be free and could go wherever she wanted. She just had to be patient. This amount of time, and that's all. After this, the man finally let her go, and the girl fell to the ground for a while. She sat silently thinking about the whole situation, and soon she collected her thoughts. She turned to the Duke and asked if he really wanted her to trust him, the closest assistant to the Crown Prince. She also asked how she could trust him, since this could all turn out to be a lie. However, Baldarian shouted loudly at her and told her not to compare him to that terrible man under any circumstances. He realized that he had raised his voice and said in a quieter voice that in any case she felt a little better after he touched her and asked if it was true. He wanted to know the real answer. For a moment, Lily thought about all this. When the man mentioned that she should feel better, she actually noticed that her fingers stopped pricking and her legs could finally feel. Her overall condition even became much better. Even the incredible pain that was present in her neck was greatly relieved. Lily sat silently and was surprised by all these factors. She did not expect that there could really be such an effect. The man then looked at her and asked if she now understood what situation she was in at all. He said, slowly drawing out each word, that Lily needed him. After this, turning around, he began to leave and told her to think carefully and rationally. He could give her time for this for a final answer, and really hoped for her cooperation. As soon as Lilia was left alone, she continued to sit on the ground and thought about the fact that she would have to go through all this for a whole year. She couldn't believe that he was actually telling her to endure another year. In fact, from the moment we did, he let her live. Every day became even more hell than the previous one. Every time he gave Lily unbearable pain, she thought that soon it would end and he would finally leave her alone. After another beating, the man turned to Lilia and said that she was his animal, which he had been taming recently. He was punishing her for trying to commit suicide, and by doing so he strangled her, but did not let her die completely. In fact, the girl at that moment had already begun to wish that she had died with her family then, and not received this so-called salvation, which turned out to be worse. And when one of the ladies decided to stand up for the girl, Dylan just cold-bloodedly killed her with his own hands, because he didn't want anyone to interfere in his affairs. Looking at Lily, he said that she was so beautiful, even for a monster, and in fact she was so attractive that he was ready to look at her throughout the day. The girl ignored her with words. She tried to distract herself, although it was unsuccessful. In fact, regret always came very late for her. She continued to endure the torment, holding on to the hope that someday Dylan would let her go. However, she could not believe that she would have to endure another year in captivity at her enemy. The girl thought that being in the estate of the Duke of Baldrian was even worse than being with the Crown Prince. She didn't know what he wanted from her and how he would treat her. She assumed that he was probably on Dylan's side and for this reason would mock her. However, since that moment, several days passed. The storm finally died down and it got a little warmer outside, despite the fact that there was still snow. Baldarian had to meet with the Din. The man was sitting opposite him and said that this was a great shame because he wanted to take him for a ride on a boat, but unfortunately he couldn't do it. The Crown Prince said that he probably did not understand that he did not really like these entertainments. However, he tried to convince the Duke that boating is best in winter. It is an unforgettable experience. The man was not at all interested in this conversation. He said that he understood everything, but he himself thought about the fact that he came only because of the problem with Lily, and the Crown Prince continued to insist on going on a boat ride. Of course, this gradually began to irritate him. He wanted to change the subject of the conversation. However, he didn't have time because Dylan himself decided to ask how Lily was chewing. The man did not react to this in any way. He only looked at the Crown Prince with a cold-blooded gaze. Then the guy laughed loudly and said that he thought so. Lily was not one of those who easily obeyed, so it was quite obvious that nothing had happened between them yet. He also said that it was also difficult for him to subdue her, after which he asked the man if he would like to receive advice on how easy it would be to handle her. Without even waiting for an answer from his friend, he said that as soon as she did not obey, he should raise his voice at the girl. We also said that he beat her and shouted. Every time she resisted, in the end, she simply had to submit to him. The man, with a smile on his face, recalling all these events, said that after her eardrums burst several times, she eventually became obedient because the healing was very difficult and long. Baldarian, hearing about all this, thought that for a person who was the crown prince, this was a real shame. But it was not surprising that the girl could not bring herself to trust her. After all, she had experienced cruel days with Dylan. In fact, the imperial family was the sun that illuminated the empire, and Duke Justeria was the moon that supported it. These two houses had long been deeply intertwined. Their connection was unbreakable. The Duke of Eustachius had an ancestor who was the twin sister of the first emperor, and thus he was the right hand of the imperial family, and they were quite close and made all decisions together. He could be in honorable roles defending the empire on the front lines or doing dirty work, such as suppressing the rebellious antics of the marquises. He had to kill people with his own hands. For generations, the imperial family and the Duchy of Justice had an inextricable symbiotic relationship. It was not surprising for Baldarian that the girl assumed that he was one of Dylan's people and did not trust him. After a short silence, the crown prince turned to the man and asked why he had made such an effort to organize this meeting for them. He must have had some purpose. Then the duke explained that Dylan had betrayed him and asked if he knew what that meant at all. As soon as the crown prince heard this, he was immediately very surprised and asked what he meant. The man explained that if the existence of this girl was revealed to the public, it would also become a huge problem for the crown prince himself. The man, hearing this, immediately smiled and asked if it was really the duke who was hinting to him at first that he should behave quietly. The man answered in a calm voice that it was necessary to observe silence for a year. Some say that during this time, it might become clear whether this was a common name or not. Therefore, he asked to endure exactly this period. Dylan, hearing this, immediately said that if it was not mutual, then he probably planned to make all this disappear. He was interested in watching a person whose whole life was always perfect, but then suddenly something changed dramatically. But in the end, the man agreed to remain silent. He said that it would be very easy for him. For this reason, he replied that the duke did not have to worry at all. After that, he took some more tea for himself, and also said that in exchange, he also had one condition, because he did not want to leave empty-handed. Dylan looked at his subordinate and said that if the common name did not appear within a year, then he would like Lily's man to return him. He believed that he needed her much more. As soon as Baldarian heard this condition, he immediately became very angry at this man. The guy did not understand how he could return Lily back to this terrible man. He put his cup of tea on the table and looked angrily at her. She told him to stop. He was finally irritated by the fact that Dylan was talking about the girl as if she was just some kind of object. After that, he thought about how Lily was already very weak and worn out when they first met, and if he returned her case. But he was even scared to imagine what kind of treatment she would receive there again. Therefore, it is quite obvious that the man definitely did not want to give her to the hereditary principal. The guy himself, seeing such a reaction from his subordinate, was surprised. He did not understand why he had such a strange reaction about all this. However, then an idea suddenly came to his mind. Smiling, he turned to the Baldaran and asked, "Doesn't he want to return her? Because he wouldn't even have taken her if she hadn't had his name on her body first." The guy, meanwhile, sighed heavily and thought that, in fact, he himself allowed himself to simply obey this man and ultimately lost his independence. Now he always had to follow this man's orders. For a while, Baldarian was silent, but then, sighing heavily, he turned to the man and asked why he suddenly wanted to bring Lily back so much. Dylan explained that if it wasn't a common name, then there was no need for the man to keep her close, because after all, men already had a fiancée, so he didn't think he needed a new woman. From that moment, several hours passed, and the man returned to his estate. As soon as he entered, he was immediately met by a knight and began to accompany him. The men headed straight to the extension and asked where the girl was at that moment. His assistant said that at this point, he had taken her to the reception room. In fact, they did not say anything at all. Baldarian, as soon as he heard who exactly had come to him, was very angry, because usually she should not have come without a prior invitation. She thought that it was very impolite of her to do this, and even rude. However, soon he came to the reception area, and as soon as the door opened, he saw the girl. This girl was very beautiful. She had long red hair. That day she put on a beige dress, and as soon as she saw that a man she knew entered the room, she immediately smiled. She put the cup on a small table and, standing up, greeted His Highness. The girl simply beamed with happiness as soon as she saw him, but the same could not be said about Baldarion. His face became even more serious. He turned to the girl and said that she had come without prior notice and assumed that it was urgent. This girl was Baldarion's bride. Her name was Camilla, and the man said that a lot of time had passed since they last met. The girl agreed with him and then replied that she came because she had not received any news from him from the party. She knew that it was impolite, but she just needed to come to him and check if everything was okay. Camilla made a very pitiful expression and asked him for forgiveness. She said that she was really sorry that she had bothered him. At this very time, Lily had finally woken up. In fact, the cold air made her cough incessantly, but she was glad that she could at least close the curtains and not look at the hated Gravitas. The girl was still chained to the bed. Despite the fact that the chains were quite short, she could reach the window. And when Lyle approached him, she opened the curtains and then suddenly saw something interesting. Her windows looked straight out onto the garden, and she saw Baldarion. However, this man was not alone. There was some young girl next to him. She looked like a noble lady, but Lily did not know her. At that moment, the girl immediately thought about the fact that perhaps this was especially his bride, which would be quite logical. Lily watched this happy couple for a while and thought that they really looked very good together and were perfect for each other. She also thought that he was the head of a prestigious ducal family, so it was quite obvious that he had a fiancée. So this person did not surprise her at all. However, in this case, the girl wondered why she was still chained and suggested that perhaps he did this in order to hide her existence from his bride. She believed that in this way he was going to hide her in principle. It was really right if he had a fiancée at home, in which case Lily was definitely a very inconvenient hindrance for him. Then the girl realized the fact that the man really wasn't lying when he said that he would free her if they didn't have a common name. Of course, having heard about this, the girl was very surprised. She thought about the fact that perhaps in a year she really could finally be free. That hope that had been lost long ago appeared in her soul. Some time had passed since then. The sun had already begun to set behind the horizon. Baldarion went to the girl in order to check if everything was okay with her, and the first thing Lilia asked was what she could do to get him to remove these shackles from her. The girls really didn't like them, and they were uncomfortable, but the man responded that she should stop wasting her energy because it would never happen anyway. Lilia replied that now she understood his situation and what exactly she had to do, so she assured him that she would no longer even try to run away. Hearing this, Baldarion was a little surprised. However, he wondered if she really understood the situation they were both in now. The man takes off the scarf that was constricting his throat and answers that if by some chance the common name does appear, they will become mutually sensitive. As soon as the girl heard about this, you were very surprised. She had never heard such words before, so of course she didn't understand what he was talking about. Taking a quick look at Lily, the guy explained that this meant that her emotions would affect his health, and even him as a person in general. He also explained that if she suffers, then he will suffer too, and if she dies, then he will die too. At that moment, Lyle finally understood what he meant, and now understood why he took such good care of her physical condition. At that moment, Baldarion suddenly extended his hand to her and suggested that they start by holding hands. He asked if it was true that her right arm was hurting quite a lot, because it was numb. He assumed that it was incredibly uncomfortable, so he suggested at least trying. Lilia wasn't sure that this was a good idea. However, the man asked if she hadn't just agreed to quietly cooperate for a year. How did he explain that they needed to observe? What consequences did their contact have? Or did he ask if perhaps she preferred him to directly touch the name on her body again, like last time? As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately thought about what this was. She definitely didn't want it. It was a very strange and awkward feeling. Therefore, she didn't need him to touch the name on her shoulder again. For this reason, she decided that this was indeed the right option. It was an unemotional tact, but simply treatment, nothing more. When the girl finally got closer to him and put her hand in his, Baldarian immediately turned to her and said that her fingers were incredibly hard, like stone. He also asked if it hurt her that they were in such a state. The girl was a little worried when she talked to him, but she said that in fact, no, she was just stunned, that's all. For a moment, Lily could only think that his hand was much warmer than she expected, and that made her a little uncomfortable. Her hand lay in his for a while, and Balderin said that judging by how her fingers had become numb again in just a few days, he would have to touch her more regularly. The girl abruptly removed her hand from him. She certainly did not want this to happen. However, the man grabbed the initiation by himself and managed to intercept her hand, after which he pulled her closer to himself. Because Lily was very weak, she immediately began to fall due to loss of orientation. However, the man was counting on this, so he very quickly sat her on his lap, continuing to hold her hand. The girl felt very awkward about this, so without even looking at his face, she asked him to let her go. But the man, putting his arm around her waist, asked if they hadn't agreed on this, so he advised her to simply remain motionless until the hardening passed. Lilia already wanted to object to something. However, she thought that even though he was simply holding her hand, she felt incredibly strange. She had a sensation as if her temperature had risen. For some reason, her heart began to beat faster, and her cheeks became flushed. But she did not have a fever, and she felt quite healthy. Baldarion looked at her for a while, and then suddenly remembered Dill's words, to which he said that the main reason he wanted to return Lyle was that this girl was incredibly beautiful. He explained that Lily had clear, beautiful eyes, and they were exactly like precious stones of rose quartz. And at that moment, when the man was so close to this girl, he immediately remembered these words and thought that her eyes really did look a bit like rose quartz. He looked at Lily without taking his eyes off her. The girl at the same time looked back at him, but quickly looked away because she had rather mixed feelings. Then Baldarion turned to her and said that the recovery was happening more slowly than when he touched her name directly. The girl, hearing about this, was immediately very surprised. She understood what he was hinting at, so she got up from his feet and stepped aside. Lyle quickly said that this was already more than enough, so he didn't have to touch her yet. Balderim sighed heavily and said that they eventually confirmed the effect, so he was pleased with the result he had, so he said that I could touch her more on this day. Then he took his handkerchief and said that he still had plans for lunch, usually, so he said that they would now meet every evening for half an hour in order to relieve her pain. Then he touched her chains and said that if she could fulfill this condition without resistance, then in that case he would definitely be able to remove the chains. At that moment, Lily continued to walk away from the man. However, he suddenly grabbed her by the chains, brought her closer to him, and wrapped his arms around her waist. They were incredibly close to each other. That's what made her even more awkward. And so, ultimately, from that day on, a lot changed in their lives. The sound of chains being pulled that used to echo around Lily's room disappeared because she had truly obediently carried out his order. An hourglass was placed on the small bedside table to measure exactly half an hour and heal her. I thought that maybe it was because she stopped resisting him. However, their relationship really did get a little better. They were no longer so tense. When one evening the man came again to heal her, Lily suddenly said that his hand was too warm. The man, hearing this, was a little surprised and immediately smiled. In fact, his touch became a little more gentle than the first times. Lily also thought that perhaps if she asked him something now, he would give her an honest answer. The girl meanwhile sat on his lap. She said that she had something she wanted to talk about, and the man allowed her to do so. Then Lyle replied that she had a small request. She wanted to know if she could get permission to access the library. Baldarion immediately looked her straight in the eyes in surprise and asked why she needed it. But the girl replied that she would like to know a little more about this name on her body. The man suddenly became a little stern. He replied that he received all the related information about this case through his assistant, so she had no need to find out more. Then Lilia replied that in fact, even if this was the name of His Highness, it worried her, and she would like to figure it all out on her own and find out more. But this was not the only reason Lily also wanted to be among books, because being alone in such a huge room in which she lived made her very lonely. Her soul wanted at least a little change around her. But most of all, she wanted to go outside. Lily immediately told the man that if he was worried about her running away, then she was not interested in it at all. He could even make people who would follow her if he was so worried. Therefore, the girl really asked him very sincerely to allow her to do this. At that moment, Baldarion noticed that their session time had already expired, so he, without giving her any answer, simply silently left the room. And the next day, there was another change that surprised Lilia incredibly. The girls were allowed to leave her room, and this happened several times a day. She could finally go to the library, and in the end, there Lily could read any books she wanted. This library was located in an extension not very far from her room, but she loved it madly. Of course, Baldarion agreed that she would visit the library only on the condition that she would be accompanied by a butler. But the girl did not object, since even this condition suited her. She believed that even though she would not be able to remain alone, she was already allowed to go outside the room, and this was a huge advancement. It was better than nothing, so the girl decided to be happy with what she had. Meanwhile, Lily had picked up a few books and sat down at the reading table and thought that the real problem was that there was too little information about this name, and she could find practically nothing. Several hours passed from that moment, and the girl read several books. She sat by the window, where the sunset was visible, and thought that she would finish reading this last one that she was holding in her hands and would return to her room. And then suddenly, after scrolling through several pages, she came across something interesting. It was something she had never seen before, so the girl decided to immediately read everything that was written there. And then Lily saw that there was information written there, that manifestors who were not common pairs of names had a high probability of dying within 5 years after the appearance of this name. At the moment the girl read this, even her hands started shaking. In other words, this meant that the girl could simply die because this name appeared on her body. Lilia was horrified after this. She thought about what would happen if Dylan came to take her away after the year she spent with Baldarion. Then she would end up in a simply terrible place. In fact, he said such terrible things and always mocked her. One day, the man even put chains on her throat and controlled her as he wanted. In fact, one day, Lily saw an open door and tried to run away. Of course, the man got very angry when he saw this, and since then she was in chains. Dylan was just awful. He yelled at the girl asking what she was planning to do once she ran away. He explained that she didn't have a home, so she had nowhere to run. Dion was so angry that he started shouting loudly at the girl and said that if she tried to run away next time, he would chase her wherever she ran and bring her back so she could not even hope for freedom. She understood that this was the only thing that she could not allow for herself under any circumstances. She was even ready to die, but not to end up with this terrible crown prince again. The girl thought about the fact that even if she had to live the rest of her life looking for a place to live and being hunted, she was ready to do this, but would never return to Dylan. As soon as she remembered everything that she had to endure in his house, she burst into tears. Her whole body trembled from these terrible memories. At that moment, she suddenly heard some laughter that came from the open window. One of the maids turned to Rose and told her not to tease her there. Lily immediately became interested, and looking down, saw that these were 2 maids who worked in this house. They were allowed to walk freely around the mansion, and she even began to envy them a little. Suddenly, the girl realized that this was her only solution. These maids could walk around the mansion and remember the routes and evacuations. These people had enough freedom to search for documents regarding the name, and so Lily decided that this was the only way she could make a better life for herself. But the most important thing that the girl understood was that the maids could even earn money, which they later freely used, and for this reason, the girl decided that this was the only way that she had left at that time. Then Lily thought about Baldarion and realized that, of course, she wouldn't be able to persuade him so easily about this. However, she was going to at least try to do this. Therefore, when night fell, the man had already begun to climb up to the girl's annex in order to heal her as usual. And when he went up to the top floor, he saw the butler and Lily. The girl was carrying several books in her hands. She was just returning from the library. The butler immediately bowed and greeted him, but Lily, meanwhile, simply stood there and looked at the man. Baldarion realized that she had no intention of greeting him properly. However, what alarmed him most was another fact. She did not understand why the girl always wore such thin clothes. It was very cold outside, and even her sleeves were not closed. Of course he understood that it was very bad, so raising his hand up, he said that he had already finished with his work. However, it turned out that it was already late, so he suggested that they finish their usual ritual as soon as possible and disperse. Lily, without even saying anything to him, went straight to her room. She walked ahead, and the man walked behind. In fact, when he walked behind her and looked at the girl, he noticed that she looked as if she could fall and lose consciousness at any second. The difference from the girl's hands, by which he constantly held her legs, hers did not heal at all. But this was quite natural, because he did not go further than the hand, and this continued every night, so the effect of the touches did not extend lower. The man thought that such a further decision would definitely not help, so he decided to take the initiative into his own hands. Baldarion approached the girl. He took her in his arms and placed her on his shoulder in one motion, thereby simultaneously holding her by the legs. The girl was very surprised when he did this. She immediately screamed loudly at him and told him to put her on the ground. But the man replied that they already needed to move on to the next stage, and simply holding hands was no longer effective. He explained that they needed to expand their contact zone a little, and as soon as Lily heard this, she immediately understood what was going on. She couldn't believe that he had actually said this and was very wary. She was afraid to imagine what he wanted from her at all. Eventually, as soon as they came back to the room, the man sat Lily down on the poof that was next to the bed. The girls felt a little bad after what happened. She turned to Baldarion and asked him to stop doing this. She didn't like it at all. However, the guy was very surprised when he heard about this and immediately asked why she said this. Lily couldn't believe that he was actually asking such basic things, so she explained that she could walk on her own and didn't need his help in this matter. The man then folded his arms across his chest, immediately chuckled, and asked if she was really sure of this. Lyle became wary and asked what exactly he meant. The man knelt down in front of her and said that he had actually never seen her walk normally, which meant that it was quite painful for her to do so. He sat opposite her, and looking straight into her eyes, also told Leela that he was very focused on how uncomfortable her hands looked, and did not even think to look at her legs, with the help of which she actively walks. As soon as the girl heard this, she was a little surprised. She thought that all this was quite strange. She knew that he was worried only because she was the owner of the name. However, this worry still caused certain feelings inside her. She didn't understand why it seemed to her that he was genuinely worried about her health. Although the man didn't even show it in any way, she just had that feeling. At that moment, Baldarion began to reach his hands towards her legs. He was about to lift her dress, but the girl stopped him and asked what he was doing. The man then explained that he was simply going to check the condition of her legs, so he asked her to remove her hands, which were preventing him from doing so. But Lily continued to resist him. She said that all this was definitely not necessary, so she asked him to stop doing it. However, the man suddenly asked if it was because he was one of those dirty people from the justice system that she could not trust him and kept distancing herself from him. As soon as the girl heard this, she was immediately very surprised. In fact, she had never really thought about it much, so she asked what exactly he meant. She thought about whether this was really true. She hated justice so much that she couldn't even express it in words. But this flag with the family coat of arms that hung on the wall opposite a few days ago was now torn down. At that moment, the girl even thought about the fact that he hung it up specifically to attract attention. However, in the end, she was not going to leave it there and look at it every day. Lilia could really think that he did all these actions out of concern for her. However, she quickly threw these thoughts away from herself because she understood that this could not be true. So she turned to the man and said that, in any case, this was not even the main problem in her health, so she believed that it was not at all necessary. But at that moment, the man took her again and put her on his shoulder. Baldarion said that if she was so disgusted, then she could just wash her feet or do something else, since she could not bear his touch on her body. The girl was again surprised that he picked her up. She started yelling at him and asked if he always carried people as if they were a sack of potatoes. Of course, it was very uncomfortable and even painful for her. She began to hit him on the back with her hands and asked him to immediately let her go to the ground. But the man, of course, did not listen to her. He knew what he had to do, and that's why he did it. Some time passed from that moment, and he suddenly brought her to the bathroom, and immediately the man put Lily in hot water, even with her clothes on. The guy turned to her and said that he didn't ask her to touch her feet. He just wanted to help her walk more comfortably. He didn't see any benefit in this for himself, but was only trying to make it better for her. He was very irritated by the girl's reaction, so he asked why she always made such a big deal out of everything and couldn't just let herself be helped. But Lily looked at him again and screamed. She told him not to blame her. She said that everything was fine with her legs, so she didn't need any help from him. The man then began to lift her dress up and said that she was still dragging her leg like a wounded bird, so he felt he simply had to do it for her well-being. The girl then looked away from him and said that she was used to this kind of walking, and it didn't bother her anymore, so she didn't understand why it bothered him so much. As soon as the man heard that she had already gotten used to walking like that, he was very surprised. And then suddenly, in a cold voice, he asked if she really had such a problem with her leg because of Dylan. As soon as Lily heard this, the terrible memories from the past came flooding back to her. In a trembling voice, she said that she didn't have to explain anything to him, so she asked him not to ask these terrible questions. The man was already starting to get tired of all this. However, he decided not to tell her anything more. He touched her leg and thus began to heal her. At first, Lyle felt a lot of pain. However, soon she felt even more comfortable. She just sat and looked away, so as not to think about the fact that his hands were on her ankle. Meanwhile, Baldurum suddenly noticed that her legs were all cut. He didn't understand why he hadn't noticed this until that moment. He immediately felt very sorry. There really were an incredible number of scars on her legs, and he was very angry, not realizing that he had done this to this poor girl and how he had mocked her. At that moment, he was incredibly angry, and as soon as he removed his hand to the edge of the bathtub in order to calm down a little, Lily suddenly reached out with a trembling hand to him and touched him. The man was very surprised to feel it in her hand. He immediately looked at the girl and saw that tears appeared in her eyes. At that moment, she looked incredibly beautiful and luxurious, despite the fact that she was still afraid. The man noticed that her whole body was shaking. He didn't understand why this was so. He even thought that she was afraid that he might be angry with her, and that was why she was shaking so much. After that, he thought about the fact that this was also another trauma because of Dylan. He became even more angry at this terrible person. He did not understand how inhuman you need to be to mock the girl like that. Then, sighing heavily, the Baldur turned to her and told her not to worry. He was not angry at her at all, so the girl did not need to tremble like that. As soon as she heard these words, her body actually calmed down a little. And then suddenly, the man did what he so abruptly wanted. He stood up from his knees and, moving closer to her, kissed her right on the lips. Lily was very surprised. However, she did not push him away from her, but only responded to the kiss. For some time they remained like that, kissing in the bathroom. After that, the man took a towel for her. He said that he heard that she was constantly reading in the library now, so he asked what her real purpose for spending time there was. The girl replied that she planned to quietly focus on recovery next year. The man, hearing this, said that this was a good attitude. He himself tried not to look at the girl's body because the dress was wet and was very tight. He handed her a towel, but Lily also said that she had a condition. The man, hearing about this, was very surprised and asked what condition they were talking about. Then Lily, looking straight into his eyes, said that she would very much like him to allow her to be a servant. As soon as the Baldurum heard this, he immediately asked if she really wanted to walk around the estate as a servant after the library. Without waiting for her answer, he told Lyle to listen to him carefully. She was in this place a guest who needed to be pampered, so he thought that this was understandable. The girl sighed heavily and said that she understood everything, but she herself wondered whether he even knew the fact that the owner of the name had a limited life expectancy. That is why she clung to the time that she'd left and asked that they give her such a desperate solution. Of course, she knew that they would not allow her the first time, but she still hoped for the best. She was silent for a while, but then, sighing heavily, She said that she understood perfectly well that he wanted to keep her existence a secret. It was quite natural and obvious, so then she asked if Baldarian really thought he could hide her forever. As soon as the guy heard this, he immediately asked again what she was even saying. He saw her confident expression and thought that she meant that she was not going to obey if he refused her request, and this, of course, made him wary. He didn't understand why everything had to become so confusing and complicated. However, he eventually did think about her request and tried to figure out how it could be implemented.